Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, November 27th, 2019 edition of Tesla Daily on Official Tesla Podcast. My name is Rob Maurer. Today we are talking about some rumors on Model Y, as well as updated short interest and a couple other topics. Tesla stock on the day today did finish up 0.7% to $331.29. That compared to the NASDAQ, also up 0.7%. Alright, so the biggest news for today is some rumors on Model Y. There's a report from a Chinese media outlet, which I believe is named Anu, saying that a couple of suppliers have received notice from Tesla that they should be accelerating their production schedule. I'm going to read the important parts here from Google Translate, so again, there may be things lost in translation here from a contextual perspective, so it's important to keep that in mind, and it's also worth remembering when we see other media reports on this topic because I think it's all sourced really from this same report. The first part of this translation reads, quote, Tesla mass production of new cars ahead of schedule. It is reported that the supply chain has been notified to stock up BizLink and HIDA operation to boost horsepower, end quote. So obviously boost horsepower doesn't make much sense there, but I would assume that means either pull up their schedule or increase their production output. The rest of the translation then reads, quote, Tesla's Model Y listing process is accelerating and the supply chain has spread. It has received notifications from Tesla at the end of the third quarter and the beginning of the fourth quarter requiring that it be prepared in advance for mass production of Model Y, which is more than the original plan. About half a year in advance, the Taiwan Supply Factory Trade Federation KY and HIDA camp can warm up, end quote. Alright, so again, the last part there, camp can warm up, doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but making assumptions again here, I would have to assume that that would be something in reference to beginning the start of production. Continuing the translation, quote, according to Tesla's original plan, Model Y was originally scheduled to be produced at the end of the year, but the recent supply chain is expected to be mass-produced in the summer of next year. It's ready, but has recently started to receive notifications, and the schedule is advanced to the fourth quarter of this year, end quote. So the translation here does imply the fourth quarter of this year, but again, it's loosely translated, and the meaning here could easily be changed. For example, if we say instead of the schedule is advanced to the fourth quarter of this year, maybe it's supposed to say something like the schedule is advanced in the fourth quarter of this year. Earlier in the article, they say that the suppliers, quote, received notifications from Tesla at the end of the third quarter and the beginning of the fourth quarter, requiring that it be prepared in advance for mass production of Model Y, which is more than original plan, end quote. So then you compare that sentence with the sentence we have here of, quote, it's ready, but has recently started to receive notifications, and the schedule is advanced to the fourth quarter of this year, end quote. So those statements are very similar, but would have obviously very different meanings, with the latter statement potentially implying that these suppliers should either be beginning or starting to ramp up their production this quarter. That's certainly possible. I think the last time we discussed this topic, we sort of expected Jan or February start of production for Model Y. So for suppliers to be ramping up towards the end of the fourth quarter, I think fits in line with that time frame, meaning I don't think this is anything necessarily new, other than perhaps some more validation for that theory. So that is still my expectation at this point. There has been some rumors floating around out there that maybe Tesla's trying to build and maybe deliver some Model Ys in the fourth quarter. I think that's probably a stretch. Maybe not impossible since I'm expecting, January or February to be the start of production. But I don't think that should really be the expectation as Tesla has already moved their timeline up. When this topic comes up, I continue to point back to the comments that Elon made off the cuff, seemingly, on the Q2 earnings call when asked about sort of sequential delivery numbers and how those would look quarter over quarter going forward. And he said, quote, I think Q1 next year will be tough. I think Q3 or Q4 will be good. Q1 will be tough. Q2 will be not as bad, but still tough. And then I see like Q3 and Q4 next year will be incredible, end quote. That quote is aged a little bit by now. That was end of July, so about 4 months old. But ever the optimist that Elon is, I don't see how that quote really makes much sense if we know that Gigafactory Shanghai should be up and running healthily in Q1, and if they planned on having significant volume from Model Y in Q1. So I don't want to rule anything out, I just think it's important to keep those expectations managed, especially as Tesla seems to already be ahead of schedule. As Elon said on the Q3 earnings call not that long ago, quote, what really matters is the timing to volume production, where volume production is some number in excess of 1,000 units per week. And we're confident of reaching that point, no later than the middle of 2020, end quote. So I think that's the best thing to anchor on right now. But either way, we're getting really close at this point. Whether it's a month from now or 3 months from now, we are very close to the start of production for Tesla's 5th vehicle. All that being said, one thing I do want to mention here just for full transparency, and if you happen to see the hyperchange video on sort of this Model Y timing, both of us received an email from a listener sharing some information that was shared with him from a service tech at one of his service appointments. So before I even go any farther, that should obviously be a big red flag to take this with a huge grain of salt. We've gotten really poor information from sources like that in the past. So generally not something I pay much attention to, but just so everyone sort of has all the information out there, I wanted to discuss it. Now, this listener also said to take this with a grain of salt, of course, but he said that the service tech said that, quote, he has friends at Fremont, and based on what he's heard, the Model Y is ready, and they are planning to deliver a few hundred Model Ys by the end of this year. Again, I'm not sure if this can be trusted, but he sounded very knowledgeable, end quote. So for what it's worth, that's out there. I don't put a ton of stock in that personally, but I know Gally also received a similar report from someone else as well. So we'll see what happens. Next today, just some quick Gigafactory news, and this is actually from last week, but Electrek noticed it today. I had missed it last week as well. But Panasonic CEO at that point said that, quote, we don't have any plans at the moment to set up a production site in China for Tesla's Chinese business. It is up to Tesla to decide whether it would use Chinese-made batteries from other manufacturers or get batteries from our Gigafactory 1, end quote. So not necessarily the best sign there in terms of Panasonic's and Tesla's relationship, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing either. Having some diversity in your supply chain has its advantages. A couple of the big ones there would be de-risking, and then it also heightens the competitiveness, I believe, of those suppliers. And that can help Tesla in negotiations. The main downside could potentially be fewer economies of scale. With Tesla's involvement in the battery production process, as well as the scale that Tesla is already at, I don't think that's a huge disadvantage at this point. One other quick note, there was apparently a power outage at Tesla's Fremont factory today. There were a few stories on Instagram, seemingly from employees, talking about it, and it looked like it was due to an issue with one of their transformers. Now, I haven't been able to verify this, so there is a chance that it's inaccurate, but from those Instagram stories, I think it's pretty authentic. Also, no way of knowing really how long the power was down, but if it was down for the day, that could mean, production of 1,000 vehicles or more. I think that would probably be a worst case scenario, and even if it were around that number, I don't think that's what's going to make or break Tesla this quarter. It's not insignificant, but I don't think it's going to be the difference between a good or a bad quarter for Tesla. So just wanted to point that out. The other update we have today is on short interest. This actually came out yesterday after market close, but with all the excitement about Cybertruck, I ended up missing it, and it looks like everybody else did too. So this update is for the November 15th settlement date, and short interest decreased from the October 31st settlement date by 1.2 million shares, or about 4% of short interest. Now, of course, the last report, we had that huge 5.4 million share drop. That was the most in Tesla's history. We kind of looked back and compared that to the previous biggest drops in Tesla's history, and that was back in May 2013, when we had a huge increase in Tesla stock that then continued to run throughout the latter half of that year. So it was a very interesting comparison to look at. But in that case, both of those May reports, we saw drops of about 4.5 million shares back to back. And those 4.5 million shares represented a much larger percentage of outstanding stock than the 5.4 million shares does today. So definitely some similarities, but not completely analogous. And then that analogy breaks down a little bit further with this report, because we only saw 1.2 million shares covered versus, again, back in May, we saw those two huge instances of covering back to back. So with this update, I don't think it's as indicative of a strong continued uptrend as maybe we had hoped when we saw that first report. For what it's worth, the stock price around that period of time did increase by about 12%, from around $315 per share to about $352 per share. So again, that 12% increase versus short interest down 4% over that same period. The next short interest update that we get should be pretty interesting. It'll be for the settlement date of November 29th, which will be this Friday. So that'll be nice visibility into short interest post Cybertruck unveiling. That report will be published after market close on December 10th, so we'll keep an eye on that and definitely check back in. The last quick thing for today is that another Car of the Year award for the Model 3. This time, it has been selected by the Danish motor journalists for the Denmark Car of the Year. The chairman of that journalist association said in a translated quote, "The Tesla Model 3 shows in many ways what direction the trend is going. Right now, there are no electric cars passing the Tesla," end quote. Always nice to see that, and I think maybe Toyota, the VP that we talked about yesterday, maybe he should take a look at that comment on where the trend is going. Maybe worth considering. All right, so tomorrow is Thanksgiving. I do plan to take that day off. I'm going to be driving and then spending some time with my family. I'll be back on Friday for the podcast. But in the spirit of Thanksgiving, I just want to say a really heartfelt thank you to everybody that listens to this podcast, everyone that has sent me feedback, emails, questions, tweets, whatever the case may be. I know I don't always get back to everything, and sometimes it's a little bit slow, but stuff like that is always appreciated, and I just really want to say thank you for all of the engagement that this listener group has. I'm really lucky to be able to do this. So thank you to all of you, and especially so to the patrons that make the podcast possible. If you're looking for a way to say thank you to me, I always appreciate reviews on Apple Podcasts. We're getting pretty close to 500 reviews now, so that is a nice little milestone that I've got my eye on. And then, of course, I obviously always appreciate the support on Patreon. If you want to learn more about doing that, you can find those details at patreon.com/Tesla Daily Podcast. And that is it for today. So I hope you all have an amazing Thanksgiving. Drive safe, be attentive on autopilot, and I'll see you on Friday for the Friday, November 29th episode of Tesla Daily. Thank you.